On this edition of Independent Sources, Destination Cuba, a time to be guarded or gung-ho as Cuba prepares for a crush of U.S. investors, and privatizing public spaces, concerns over the threat to free political speech as more public spaces are being bought up. Those stories and more coming up on Independent Sources. Welcome to Independent Sources, bringing you news from New York's ethnic and immigrant communities. I'm Garry Pierre-Pierre. Last month, I spent a week in Cuba and found the country excited about the prospect of good relations with their northern neighbor, the United States. After more than 50 years of a punishing embargo by the U.S., Cubans are hopeful that Americans can start visiting in large numbers and invest in their economy. Already, American entrepreneurs are kicking the tires in Havana and are looking for opportunities. But is this what the Cuban government officials had in mind when they began opening up the economy in the mid-1990s? I spoke with Queens College professor Sujata Fernandez about whether Cubans should be guarded in their optimism and what better relations with the U.S. means for the average Cuban. Dr. Fernandez, people in Cuba nowadays are very happy about opening up relationship with the United States. Should they be excited or should they be worried about the new relationship that's coming down the pike?
I think they should be both excited and worried. I think there are some aspects of the changes that people are legitimately concerned about how the Cuban government is going to handle it. For instance, the incoming of large corporations like Google, like Netflix. People are legitimately concerned about what degree of that kind of any agreements that are made will actually trickle down, what benefits will be received by the Cuban population. I think where they see people see more opportunities are in the chance to open up more people-to-people type contacts, the kind that can encourage small businesses, the kind that can encourage cultural exchanges, intellectual exchanges, all of the things that we've started to see more of happen in the last 6 months or so.
So how will the government handle the Googles, the Apples in the tech industry of the world?
Well, what we've seen so far is that they have been inviting them for talks, trying to explore what kind of options exist, not really looking into alternative types of arrangements, like open source technology, for instance, which is something that the Venezuelan government did a lot. The Cuban government so far hasn't been looking into those routes, but I do think that there is a very engaged sort of citizenry in Cuba who are interested beyond the interests of the Cuban government itself in thinking about ways of moving forward that don't necessarily follow the path simply of handing over Cuba's infrastructure to major corporations like Google, that are interested in finding alternative paths that would involve Cuban social movements and organizations to a greater degree.
How so? How do you blend the two?
So, for instance, since the changes over the last year or so, there have been a lot of kind of small projects getting off the ground in the area of the internet. So there's been websites. One example I can think of is on Cuba. There are various sort of projects, documentary projects, and others where people are trying to sort of think of how they can use the internet in ways that tie into their own grassroots movement activism or sort of social concerns over, say, climate change, for instance, and how they can tie that into their own projects rather than simply, say, a company like Netflix, which comes in and has no idea of how things are on the ground, and so finds that really not many Cubans have access to the internet to even use Netflix.
It's interesting you concentrate a lot on the tech industry, but I was in Cuba last month and I realized that Cuba needs a lot more infrastructure in place before the Netflixes of the world can really take hold. So what is the government plan on making sure that the country is ready to take advantage of these opportunities?
Well, I think that there is not consensus on the idea that Cuba needs to have a complete overhaul of its infrastructure. And for instance, there was something called El Paquete Cultural Semanal, the weekly packet, which was an offline way of distributing material on the internet. And it seemed like about half to two-thirds of the island was actually actively consuming the internet through passing it around through hard drives and passing around information that way. And so the assumption that Cuba needs to have a complete rehaul of its infrastructure is something that Cubans have been questioning and saying maybe what we need is something more driven from our side of things. Maybe we can build our infrastructure, but not in ways that that mean a sort of complete rehaul of what exists, but ways that actually meet our needs and demands.
Mm-hmm. During the mid-90s, Cuba went through what they call the special period, where things were really, really terrible. They'd lost the support of the Soviet Union after that collapse. And so Castro turned to tourism as an economic development engine. Can Cuba remain competitive in that field? And also, what other opportunities do they have now that relations with the U.S. are improving?
Well, it is true that, Cuba was in a really bad position when the Soviet Union collapsed, because that was the main, sort of their main ally, their main source of essentials like oil and like gasoline and main provisions. And so when they, collapsed, Cuba was really left quite bereft. And I think that the process of the last 2.5 decades has been rebuilding the system. And one of the main ways it's been able to earn foreign currency in the face of the U.S. embargo has been to engage in tourism, and that has proved a fairly successful strategy. I can't speak to whether it will remain competitive, but I can say that one thing that has happened in the last 25 years since they have really been following this this path is that there has been a lot more inequality in Cuban society, is that we've seen people with access to the tourism industry, and that tends to be white Cubans because they're usually the ones who are hired within the tourism industry, have benefited, and those who have been excluded from this tourism industry, and that's been mostly Afro-Cubans, have suffered more. And this is a problem that we've seen, and unless Cuba can find a way to sort of move forward in ways that don't widen this income gap, I think it's going to produce more of a crisis internally in the country.
But can Cuba do that? Is it ready to really maintain sort of like this more or less social equality that at least they're known for, even if it's not completely that way, as you mentioned?
Yeah.
Can they continue some of that? Because the people in Cuba are afraid. Some people are afraid of that.
Yeah.
And who are some of these people?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends the degree to which the people who are running Cuba and the people who are in charge can actually develop relationships where they're listening to people at the grassroots, where they're listening to the organizations on the ground. And so, for instance, in the last 20 years, there have emerged 20 Afro-Cuban organizations on the island. When just in the early 90s, there were no organizations. And those organizations are all saying these same things. They're saying we need to have a form of development that includes Afro-Cubans, that involves us as part of the process, and that doesn't widen this gap. And so they're calling for more capital going to Afro-Cuban run businesses, for instance. Now, the government needs to be able to include them as part of their developments going forward. They need to be able to find ways to incorporate these grassroots organizations into the planning, into the decision-making that takes place. And I think if they can, then they may be able to find a way to include both the principles of social equity on which Cuban socialism has been based and kind of find a path forward economically. But if they don't do that, I think that there are going to be a lot of people left behind.
Now, Cuba is undergoing a transformation as we speak, from communist rule to some semblance of democracy and open market, free market economy. Now, are they following the Chinese model or the Russian model right now?
I think they're much more closely following the Chinese model in the sense that, the Soviet Union, the Russian model was one of kind of really just embracing quite openly liberal capitalist democracy. And what the Cuban government is doing is kind of opening very slowly. Like the Chinese government, they want to preserve the gains that, 40, 50 years of a socialist government has has won in terms of education, healthcare, social welfare, all of the sort of benefits that the Cuban people enjoy. They want to preserve that to some extent, and they recognize that just opening up to a market economy is going to erode those gains. And so they're trying to find that path forward, much like the Chinese government will. And I think, of course, there's many differences in that the Chinese, China's a much huger country than Cuba, different kinds of relationship with the U.S. I mean, there's a whole lot of differences between them, but I think that it's much closer to the Chinese model.
So now, last question. How do Cuban Americans feel about the situation now? Are they excited to be going back home? Or have they been removed for so long that Cuba is not quite the home that they thought? What's going on with that community?
Well, I think we can't really talk about Cuban Americans as a community or as a homogenous group because there's so many waves of migration. There is the earlier migration, those who left soon after the revolution, some of whom still hold out some hope of reparations, some of whom still hold hostility towards the government. Then there is a much newer wave, those who came in the sort of the period of the 80s and 90s and later, who come from a different sector of Cuban society. Some of those have been sort of retained connections with Cubans on the ground and have sort of become the new entrepreneurs. Some of them have become very wealthy, mediating between Cuba and the United States. So they're sort of a different sector. And so I think that there are many different kinds of groups. But I think more and more Cubans are starting to see themselves not just as those who live on the island, but at those who live in the diaspora as well, meaning those in the United States and those outside in Europe and other places as well.
Okay. Unfortunately, we have to leave our conversation there. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, pleasure. Still to come on the show, moving politics out of public spaces and the effect on the suburbs. Before that, Crystal Lowe has some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a look at some headlines from New York's ethnic and community media. Gay City News covers a new survey highlighting disparities in educational attainment suffered by transgender individuals living in New York State. The study was produced by the Strength in Numbers Consulting Group on behalf of the Empire State Pride Agenda. It found that the transgender portion of the LGBT community is 50% more likely to be in poor or only fair health, 150% more likely to have a history of homelessness, twice as likely to live in poverty, and 3 times more likely to have less than a high school diploma. Discrimination is central to all of the report's findings. Transgender individuals who excel in education unfortunately find themselves rejected when it comes to obtaining employment. In response, Governor Andrew Cuomo recently announced that the State Division of Human Rights will now interpret non-discrimination provisions based on sex and disability to cover instances of anti-trans bias. In other news, the Clean Slate Initiative of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office recently gave residents of the 5 boroughs with outstanding warrants a chance to present their case in front of a judge to obtain a pardon. The Soul Saving Church of Harlem recently hosted hundreds of people seeking pardons for low-level offenses. El Diario La Prensa reports that there is currently no formal plan to decriminalize misdemeanors. The Office of the City Council Speaker, Melissa Mark Viverito, states that 85% of the cases that reach the court system are low-level violations, not criminal offenses. Although judges assign bail to 20% of the cases, only a few of these offenders are able to pay. The rest end up on Rikers Island and other jails throughout the city, awaiting trial. The Clean Slate Initiative is offering New Yorkers a more viable alternative to incarceration and serves as a critical step in rebuilding relations with the justice system and the community. An abandoned community garden on West 134th Street in Harlem is now flourishing thanks to a former limousine business owner turned healthy eating advocate, Tom Hillary. Hillary runs Harlem Grown, an independent nonprofit organization whose mission is to inspire youth to live healthy and ambitious lives. The Riverdale Press recently profiled Hillary, who says that the children served by Harlem Grown all live at or below the poverty line. Hillary started Harlem Grown in 2011 to teach young people good eating habits, in addition to providing them with the land to grow their own food. And finally, Korea Daily reports that the Coons Master Players by the Dongrak Performing Arts Group will be the first of a 2015-2016 open stage series planned by the Korean Cultural Service of New York. Dongrak will play various Korean traditional percussion instruments, such as the Korean-style gong, janggu, drum, and others, and the pungmul play. Donggrak was founded under the auspices of Crown Hai Tai, a Korean confectionery company with the motto of share happiness beyond social rank and hierarchy. The award-winning performing arts group will be performing traditional Korean folk music and theater at the Flushing Town Hall on December 11th at 8 p.m. free of charge. Those were just a few headlines from the city's ethnic and community media. Independent sources will be right back.
Thanks for staying tuned. This week on the Shelf segment features the book Public Spaces, Marketplaces, and the Constitution. I spoke with the book's author, Tony Maniscalco, about how the growing privatization of public spaces can affect free speech in the United States. Tony, public spaces, marketplaces, and the Constitution, shopping malls, and the First Amendment. Can you explain to our viewers how these three concepts relate?
Well, you know, the fact is that a lot of the space in our cities and suburbs is being privatized. It's being taken offline. It's being bought up. And it's being turned into something very different from the public spaces that we thought about when we were, you know, a little bit younger. So there have been, is a legal tradition that has essentially stripped shopping malls of the First Amendment. So the First Amendment was once permitted in shopping malls, and over time it got banished by the Supreme Court and then subsequently by a number of state courts that upheld the decisions of the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm. And so you talk about public space. In journalism, I don't know if you know much about the history of journalism, but the first way that we used to get our news is that people would come into the town square and somebody would read out the news to the populace. And so you're seeing a less and less tradition of that. I mean, technology has had a lot to do with it, but you talk about the public space. Is that a serious concern, or because of new media, new technology, we no longer need the public space as a way to communicate?
I think physical space, you know, what they call meat space, is vital in suburbs because there are so few places where people actually stop and congregate, right? People in suburbs are in their cars.
Sure.
The shopping mall is one of the few places where they actually park the car, get out of the car, and then become pedestrians for a period of time. So I think that physical space is a really, really vital one if you want to share political ideas. I use virtual space. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter. I think they're great things. The Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street benefited greatly from the ability to spread messages via Twitter and social media. I am not convinced, however, that virtual space is going to be the be-all, end-all of a public sphere in this country or elsewhere. We preach to the choir. You know, we sort of pick our audiences with social media, so we're already communicating with people who agree with us.
Like-minded people.
Exactly. Which, you know, is a positive, but if we want to have the exchange of controversial ideas, okay, then I think social media may have limitations. It also leads us to a form of political activity that I consider to be sort of thin, you know, what they call clicktivism or slacktivism. In addition, the idea that, you know, social media is public space confuses the medium with the message. So when we saw the Arab Spring and what we saw in what happened in 2010 to 2011, social media was vital in getting people to come out to Zuccotti Park and to the squares of those places that we heard about. But ultimately what impacted decision makers, in my view, was the assemblage of real people in real places.
You talk about the suburbs, you know, as you know, as you write in your book, it's changing tremendously. New immigrants are moving to the suburbs. And how is that changing the dynamics? I mean, you rightly pointed out, I live in the suburbs. There's very few places to congregate. And so what are the consequences of this trend?
You know, cities have always been places where a multiplicity of people came together. People of different races, ethnicity, classes, right, and social strata. And cities have over time been vital places for those people to come together, to see each other, right, to have that visibility, and then to negotiate and even to argue from the point of view of their political ideology. So the idea of a city as a melting pot is also, is accompanied by the idea of a city as a place where contestation happens, right? Where we argue it out, okay? My concern with the limiting of public space in the suburbs is that as the script gets flipped and the suburbs become the places of diversity, that if we don't have physical spaces online for new suburbanites to negotiate their identities and to argue over political ideas, they're not really going to be able to do it. And the book tries to show that when we don't have places to do this, we tend to go into our own little private spheres, right?
Silos that we just live in. But one of the things that I wanted to touch upon, talking about public space, Mayor Bloomberg turned Times Square, much of the city, into public spaces. And I remember the argument then was that, well, this is a really bourgeois mindset, and we need this, we need that, and who needs chairs in Times Square or Union Square? And so what do you make of that discussion where people want that space for other things as opposed to a place of congregation?
That's a tricky one for me. On the one hand, I celebrated the move by Bloomberg and Commissioner Khan to create pedestrian plazas. I want there to be as much physical space online as possible for people to just come together and sometimes do nothing, or just to look at each other, right? Because I think that quality of visibility is an important one. I think you're right, though. A lot of these spaces have been transformed in a very brief period of time into glamorized food courts, right? So you're getting, you're going to a public space, let's say at Herald Square or Times Square, and the thing you're greeted with is not political ideas, but lobster rolls and designer tacos and all kinds of opportunities to buy your way into that public space. And that's my concern about the privatization of public space, that there's no place for people to be there if they're not there as consumers. So I share your concern.
But also, in America at least, I don't see these public spaces as a place for political discussions or even social discussion. Whereas in Europe, there's someone standing on a platform somewhere talking to a crowd and there's a conversation. I don't see that much going on. Most of the public spaces, be it a park or just a plaza of some sort, it's usually, we're just busy doing our thing, whether we're looking at a phone or we're having a personal conversation. So when did these spaces in this country at least stop being this place where we could discuss the First Amendment?
That's an interesting question, and a lot of it seems to be about culture. We became less interested in using the spaces as places of political activity. I have a slightly different take on that.
Sure.
I think the law really drove the use or the disuse of public spaces, common shared spaces, as places of political activity. There's a very rich tradition in this country of using squares and parks and sidewalks and other places, unconventional places, to disseminate political ideas. As the law developed in the latter half of the 20th century, in the wake of suburbanization, the Supreme Court and state courts began to restrict and impose limitations on these public spaces, and thereby, I think, made them much less inviting, legally speaking, for political activity. And sometimes the culture follows the law. If you don't think you can use a space, or you're concerned that there's going to be some legal ramifications for doing so, you might not look at it the same way that you used to. And I think you're right. In the last 50 years, we have not really used those traditional spaces or the newer ones that have come online to do politics. And that bothers me, because I want to have a country with an active public sphere.
And what can be done about that? I mean, people are so busy living their lives. I mean, when you think about it, this is a very northeastern sort of like concept nowadays. If you look at the southern belt, it's a huge suburban. Even these cities, there's only very small place where the downtown you congregate. And so do you think that there should be a policy from the Washington about that. You're talking about the laws in terms of enhancing, making it worthwhile for cities to create these sort of spaces.
The good news is that architecturally, we're beginning to build within suburban communities the kinds of places, the cities, the sidewalks and the streets that we used to associate with cities. The so-called new urbanism is a design canon that is beginning to put these kinds of spaces back online in suburban communities, in order to reduce vehicle miles traveled and to create a sense of place. It's an environmental movement as much as anything else. So we're beginning to find the place, the physical place, where people can do the kinds of negotiations that they used to do in cities. However, the problem is that the law is not keeping up. Okay. So while the Old Town Center is being built, right, even if it's a facsimile of it, the current law as pertains to free speech in publicly shared places doesn't allow the dissemination of political ideas in virtually all kinds of places, particularly those that are privately owned. And most of these new urbanist developments are in fact privately owned places that happen to look like cities, but if we want them to behave like cities, which is what I want, then the law is going to need to catch up and catch up fast.
Okay, great. So where can we find this book?
You can find it on Amazon.com. It's at Barnes & Noble, SUNY Press, which is the publisher. A little shout out to them. They have it in their warehouse, and I'm sure 1 million booksellers have it. So please look out for it online or pick it up in a bookstore somewhere in the city.
Well, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. Till next time, be independent-minded.